Good afternoon, everyone. Those who were here last week will have seen that I was here last week, and it was my birthday, so I got sung happy birthday, which I was very glad about because I was disappointed that I wasn't going to be in my church where they would have sung happy birthday, but you actually did it better than my church does it, so I'm glad I was here. I was surprised, well, I'm surprised to be standing here now because I thought I came here on a vacation and now I'm standing here speaking. But sometimes we're called to do things that we're not expected to do. Before we begin, can you bow your heads as we just have a short prayer? Our Father in heaven, I want to thank you for bringing each of us here this morning, this afternoon, that we can look into your word and that we can discover truths that you would have us to learn and help us to learn things that will change our lives for the better and help us to serve you better. We pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So to start with, I want you to use your imagination. I want you to imagine that you're outside, maybe just walking along the street. Could be in this country, could be in another country. But as you're walking along the street, you see a little girl who's just lying on the pavement, just lying on the road. She's clearly not well. She's almost unable to move. You can see that she's not been looked after, she's been neglected. She looks as though maybe she's even close to death. You don't know how long she's been there, but she obviously needs help. Now it's puzzling because you would wonder, well, how did she come to be there? Why is she there? How long has she been there? And how come so many people have gone by and she's still just lying there? If you saw her, what would you do? That's a question that you can answer. So if I ask a question, feel free to tell me. If that was you and you walked past and you saw that girl, what would you do? Any answers?
Wait. Call an ambulance and then wait next to her.
Okay.
Until it comes, and then maybe go with her to the hospital.
Okay. So you'd call an ambulance, you'd wait with her, and go to the hospital maybe with her too. Okay? Anyone?
Obviously noticing her and starting a conversation. What's wrong with you? Where here?
Yes.
How to
Yeah. So you're trying to find out what...
Yeah, to start a conversation.
Okay.
Check her.
Okay. Well, would you agree that it is a curious thing to find someone in that condition? You'll be wondering, well, where are her parents with her? How do you lose a child and you haven't noticed that they're not in the home? But as you can imagine, in some places it is a reality. Sometimes there are children who are just there. They may have lost their parents, or they have no parents. So it can happen. It sounds strange, but it can happen. Okay, now I want you to move forward in time a little. So, our sister said she would call the ambulance, maybe go with her to the hospital. Now I want you to imagine you're not the person who took her to the hospital. I want you to imagine that you work at the hospital and you see the child come in. So they're bringing the child in, and obviously someone has to be assigned to now look at this girl and assess her situation. She's almost lifeless, she's very weak, you can see she hasn't eaten for a long time. She needs some kind of assistance. maybe you're the person who is going to treat her, or maybe it's another of your colleagues. One of your colleagues speaks to the girl, and what they ask is, what is your favorite food? They say, do you like cake? Do you like ice cream? Because she's a girl, she's a child, they assume, yes, children like cakes, they like ice cream. So what they prescribe as her treatment is, they're going to give her cake and ice cream because they're thinking she's not had anything nice to eat for a long time, so I'm suggesting cake or ice cream. What do you think of that as a treatment? Or how many would prescribe cake and ice cream for her first treatment? Anyone?
For her first treatment, you give water.
You would rather give water,
Water first.
but water doesn't taste as nice as cake or ice cream.
Before the treatment was anything. But the first, you say first treatment.
Okay. So why? Why would you give water rather than something nice like cake?
Because for example, if she eat for long, she have to drink water first.
Okay. Okay. Any other comments?
Cake and ice cream. I choose cake and ice cream
Okay, you.
because it's a good starting point to
Okay.
get friends with her and to open her heart and to regulate her emotions.
Okay.
And that, yeah,
Okay.
securely do that.
Okay. I can see the point of that. What if she wasn't even conscious? So she's not now even aware of the cake and the ice cream. Would you still give the cake and
No,
ice cream?
That's another point.
Okay.
Of course not.
Okay.
IV fluids,
So you would start with fluids
yes.
and maybe other nutrients. So depending on her condition, you might give something different. If she's not that bad, cake and ice cream may be okay. But if she's unconscious, not responsive, and you can see she's clearly in need of fluids, for example, you wouldn't try to force her with cake and ice cream first. You would try to do what is most relevant. Is that true?
Oh,
Okay.
I have a pediatrician here
Oh,
who says you should take her glycemic index first because she could have diabetes type 1. And you'd be making her worse
okay.
with cake and ice cream.
Okay, that's a very good answer. So depending on the situation, you have to choose what is most relevant for her survival. Is that right? Okay. Now we're going to look at a few passages from the Bible. As was said earlier, the title I gave to this was irrelevant. Now there are different ways that things can be relevant or irrelevant. Now I'll mention some text. We won't necessarily read all the way through them, but I'll give you the text so that you can see. So the first one is from John chapter 21 and from verses 21 to 23. It's a story you're probably familiar with, and it's a conversation between Jesus and Peter. Now, during that conversation, Jesus was speaking to Peter and he asked him about, do you love me? And Peter said, yes, I love you. And Jesus repeatedly said to him, feed my sheep, feed my lambs. Now, at one point, there was another disciple nearby. And Peter asked Jesus the question, Lord, what about this disciple? And Jesus answered, if I want him to remain alive until I return, what is that to you? As in, what has that got to do with you? So what was he saying to Peter? What he was saying to Peter was, you're asking a question about something which is completely irrelevant to you. what I want this disciple to do is my choice. If I ask him to stay here and stay alive until I return, or if I don't, it makes no difference to you. So while you, Peter, may think it's an interesting question, it is actually irrelevant to you because that is just between me and that disciple. Does that make sense? Okay, the next passage. John chapter 12, verses 3 to 6. So the first situation that we looked at with Jesus and Peter, Peter is asking about something which is just of no relevance at all for Peter. But now we have a different type of relevance. Again, I won't read all the verses, but I'll just paraphrase what was happening. This is the story where Jesus went to a home, to a party that he was invited to. And it says that Mary came and she brought a box of expensive perfume, a fragrance. And while Jesus was there, she took this perfume, she washed his feet, she dried his feet, and she anointed him with this very expensive, very fragrant perfume. But there was someone there who had a complaint about what Mary had done. Judas, it says, complained and asked, why wasn't this expensive oil sold and then we could have used the money to help the poor? Are we familiar with that story? So Judas is saying that Mary has wasted this money because she has spent it and put it on Jesus' feet, but the amount of money could have fed a lot of poor people. I think I read once that the cost of that oil was equivalent to about 1 year's salary for an average person. So it was very expensive oil. But then as you continue to read the text, we are told that the reason Judas made that comment was not because he cared about the poor. The Bible tells us that he only complained because he was a thief. And because the money was normally put in the bag that he had control over, if the money had been there, he would have been able to steal some of that money too. So here you have a situation where something is being said and it sounds like a relevant concern. Judas sounds as though he really is concerned about the poor and the waste. But the Bible is telling us he only wanted it to sound relevant, but it wasn't really relevant. If that money had been saved and put in the box, Judas would not have helped the poor. He would simply have stolen some of the money. Does that make sense? So it sounds relevant what he's saying, but in reality, coming from him, it was not relevant. Now to another example. This is from Matthew chapter 23 and verse 23. And Jesus is speaking to the Pharisees, the scribes and the Pharisees. He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you pay tithe of mint and anise and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, faith. These you ought to have done without leaving the others undone." So now we have an example where Jesus is saying, you were doing some things which were right and relevant to do. However, in the context of other things, there were more important things that you should have focused on too, but you have left those and have focused on these. You're focused on paying tithes of everything, even the little herbs that you use, but yet still you have shown no justice, no mercy, no faith. Yes, you should have paid your tithe, but paying the tithe is not really all that is needed. You need to be living a life of justice, of mercy, so you should do them all. So you have something which, yes, paying the tithe was relevant, but its relevance is still in context with a greater relevance where you've missed out the relevance of something more important. If we go back to the earlier story about Jesus and Mary, if you look at Jesus' response to Judas, he made this comment: "Let her alone. She has kept this for the day of my burial. For the poor you have with you always, but me you do not have always." So even there you can see that Jesus was pointing out that at certain times there are things that are more relevant than others. Yes, helping the poor is relevant, but as he was saying, they were able to help the poor even after Jesus had been crucified and buried. But what Mary was doing, she was doing it for his burial. She couldn't wait until afterwards because she would need to do that now. So again, you can see that you can look at things in context. At certain times, there is something that is most important, that is most relevant. Now, if you think back to what I was saying about the little girl, you see how relevance is important, or can be important, to survival. When you think about the little girl, there are two types of relevance that saves that girl. The first one is that she has to be relevant to someone. The reason why she is there is because until someone does something to help her, everyone sees her as irrelevant. Maybe someone walks past, they have their own children, that's not their child, so they say, well, she's not my responsibility, she has her own parents, they should be looking after her. So because she's not relevant to them, they walk past and they do nothing. But as you said, if you came and you saw her, when you see her life as relevant, you will do something to save her. Is that right? You will take her to the hospital, you'll try to do something to save her life. But when she gets to the hospital, you see another relevance that comes into play. Because as we discussed, depending on her condition, it may need different treatment. For you to save her life, you have to give the treatment that is most relevant at that time. So if she is dehydrated and she needs fluids, you have to give her fluids. You can't give her cake or ice cream or whatever, because if she's dehydrated, giving her cake will not save her. She could still die of dehydration even while enjoying the cake. So depending on the circumstance, you do what is relevant. So you have to see her as relevant to save her, but you have to do what is relevant also to save her. Does that make sense? Okay. Now, in reality, I'm not really speaking about a little girl, but this little girl could represent different things. It could represent a real person that needs help, but it could also represent something else. Today I want us to think about our church. You can think about the Seventh-day Adventist Church as a whole, or you can think about this church here specifically. This church here could be like the little girl. And you wonder, well, how, in what way is the church like the little girl? The church is dependent on all of us as members. Do you agree?
Yes.
Because the church is not a living being itself, but it has members that operate the church, that function in the church, and that does all of the things that the church needs to do. But why do we do things? Why do we come to church? Why do we have a pastor? Why do people preach? Why does someone play the piano? Someone comes and collects the offerings. Why do we come here? All of us who are here today saw some relevance to be here, otherwise we would be somewhere else. If we thought there was somewhere more important to be, we would be there and not here. Do you agree? But for some reason, at least today, we decided this was the most relevant place for me to be. And because of that, we are here. And as we look at the things that need doing in the church, as we see them relevant, we choose to do them. But what happens if we don't see the relevance of the various functions of the church? Then who does them? The less that we see them as relevant, the more that the church struggles to function, because everyone thinks, well, I don't need to do it. I may think, okay, the church has a pastor, so why should I be up here speaking? He can speak every week. So I just come and I sit and I listen, but I don't do anything because I don't see the relevance of me personally doing something. Do you understand what I'm saying? So the things that we see as relevant, we will do them. Now the question is it just the things that I like to do that I see as relevant? Or is it just the things that I want to see for myself that I see as relevant? Or do I see other things as relevant for me to do, even though they're not what I personally benefit from? So for the church to survive, people need to see the church as relevant. But in the same way, we also need to do what is relevant too. Suppose, for example, the building was falling apart. Now, I could say, I like to sing. So when I come to church, all I'm interested in is singing. But if I can see that the church, the building needs fixing, and I have money to give to fix it, but I say, no, I'm only interested in singing, where do I sing when the building has fallen down? So, even though I may be focused on singing, at some point I have to realize there is a need now that is more relevant than my singing. There is a need to provide a building for the church, otherwise there will be no church and my singing will become irrelevant. So just like the little girl, I have to see the church as relevant, but I also need to be willing to do what is relevant when the church needs it. I can't just come and please myself and do whatever I prefer to do. I need to be willing to see what does the church need, and then I do what is relevant. Now there's a text in Romans chapter 12, verses 6 to 8. And this is where I'm going to finish. This text says the following: In His grace, God has given us different gifts for doing certain things well. So if God has given you the ability to prophesy, speak out with as much faith as God has given you. If your gift is serving others, serve them well. If you are a teacher, teach well. If your gift is to encourage others, be encouraging. If it is giving, give generously. If God has given you leadership abilities, take the responsibility seriously. And if you have a gift for showing kindness to others, do it gladly. So we see here that all the needs of the church, God has actually already prepared the gifts to serve the church. But the question for us is, when we come to the church, are we willing to find out what we can do? Are we willing to find out what gifts we have and then put them to the service of the church? If we see the relevance, we will look for our gifts and we will try to serve the church in what ways we can. But we have to be careful that our church does not become irrelevant to us, because if it becomes irrelevant to us, we will stop functioning, we will stop helping the church. But also, we have to see what does the church need, and we use the gifts that God has given to us to make that church flourish. Now, I've spoken about the relevance of the church to us here as members, but is the church only relevant to members here? What do you think? Should the church be relevant to anyone else other than the members here?
Yes, sure.
Okay, so I'm going to put you on the spot. You said yes, sure. Who else should the church be relevant to? To the community? Yes, of course. Now, they may not even know as yet of the church. There may be people in the community that don't know. But when you are a church that is functioning and is working to help your community, your church will become relevant to them. And surprisingly enough, when your church becomes relevant to them, they also will now do things to help the church. So, it is not just the members here that can benefit from the church, because God didn't put us here as a church just to serve ourselves. He put your church in this community to help a certain community. And so the church becomes relevant to that community too. So we should also be thinking that we should be making our church relevant to the community around, so that they can benefit and that they too will also share the same sense of responsibility. So when your building is falling down, you won't just be relying on the members here. You'll find that people who are not even members of the church will be willing to come and rebuild your church. Why? Because your church is relevant to them. They may not as yet believe what you believe. They may not even believe in God. But yet they will come and fix your church because you have become relevant to them. And this is what I think God has asked us to do. To be here in the world and to be salt and light in the world. And if we use the gifts that He has given to us to make His church relevant to them, they will eventually come and learn of Him because we made ourselves relevant. So I'm going to leave you with that thought of thinking about relevance. Why is this church relevant? And what is relevant to this church to make it function, to make it prosper, and to make it relevant to your community? That when Jesus comes, both the members of this church and the community around will be able to join together and meet him when he comes. Amen.
Amen.